They said the marble gleamed even at night, as if the moon itself bowed to Rome's new god. The Palatine Hill shimmered beneath torches that never went out, their flames licking the statues of gods whose faces had been carved and recarved until they all resembled one man. Gaius, Julius, Caesar, Augustus, Germanicus, the world called him Caligula, had built not a palace, but a stomach, a living thing that swallowed the poor, the noble, the faithful, and spat out silence. It fed on fear the way lions fed on flesh. To serve within its walls was to vanish from history while still breathing. You did not enter. You were absorbed. The corridors whispered like veins carrying the pulse of an empire gone insane. The air smelled of incense, oil, and decay. That sweet Roman blend of wealth and rot. Somewhere beyond those endless arches, laughter fluttered like dying birds. The emperor was awake again. When Caligula did not sleep, Rome forgot how. He had been born in glory, raised among legions who kissed the dust of his sandals, and crowned in thunder. But by the time his name burned above the empire, he had mistaken applause for worship. He thought thunder answered to him. He thought the sea owed him obedience. He thought gods envied him. And perhaps they did, for even the divine had never been so adored and so feared in the same breath. Servants told each other that the palace had moods. On days when the torches burned blue, the emperor laughed. On days when they smoked black, he hunted. The rules changed by the hour. Yesterday you were praised for your posture. Today that same bow might be seen as mockery. The marble floors remembered everything. Every cry and confession, every secret death swept away before dawn. There was a new servant that week, a boy from the provinces, thin, polite, unaware that his life had already been written in someone else's handwriting. He had been taken from a temple, chosen for his beauty, or his silence, or perhaps both. The first night he slept in linen, softer than any he had known, yet woke drenched in terror, convinced he had dreamed a god's breath against his ear. Outside, flutes moaned through the corridors. Inside, he prayed to be invisible. Caligula loved invisible people. They made the best witnesses. He would pass them in the hall, touch their faces, with the same hand that had just signed a death order, and smile. To the emperor, affection and punishment were identical acts. Both proved his divinity. His laughter carried through the palace like a whip. Some nights he summoned senators and soldiers to dine beside slaves, forcing them to eat, until sickness blurred dignity. The wine was red enough to resemble something else, and sometimes it was. Beyond the banquets lay the darker chambers, rooms forbidden even to guards. There, Caligula practiced conversations with gods no one else could see. He accused Jupiter of jealousy, kissed his own reflection, as though forgiving it for existing, and ordered the moon to stay in place while he bathed. The servants who lit those rooms rarely survived to light them twice. Their tongues were heavy with the weight of what they had heard. Outside, the city pretended everything was fine. Bread was distributed, games were held, and statues rose daily. Rome loved its theatre, and Caligula had made himself the eternal play. Senators cheered by day and trembled by night. Mothers told their children that even to dream of him was dangerous. The empire still functioned, taxes collected, armies marched, but under the marble skin of order. Madness pulsed like infection. In that first month of his reign as living god, the palace grew louder. Lions roared beneath the banquet halls. Chained to golden cages, musicians played until their fingers bled, forced to compose hymns in his honor. Priests knelt before his throne, chanting praises, written moments earlier by trembling scribes. And through it all, Caligula watched with those bright, fevered eyes, as if searching every soul for proof that he was real. They said he no longer believed in death, that every execution was a rehearsal for immortality, that each scream reminded him he was still awake. Even the air seemed to serve him, thick with perfume and panic. Yet behind the cruelty lay something stranger: loneliness, vast enough to fill a palace. For every god needs worshippers, and every worshipper must someday disappoint. One night, the new servant was summoned. No explanation, no escort of honor, only a whisper. The divine Caesar wishes to see you. The boy walked barefoot across the marble, his reflection trembling beside torchlight. As he entered the great hall, he saw Caligula reclining on a couch, surrounded by laughter that did not belong to the living. The emperor's smile was tender, almost human. "Do you believe in me?" he asked. The boy nodded, because breath itself depended on that answer. "Good," said Caligula. "Then perhaps I shall believe in you." The torches flared as if exhaling. Somewhere, a woman screamed. Somewhere else, a poet began a hymn that would never be finished. The palace sighed, settling its stones, digesting another soul. Outside, Rome slept beneath a sky that had forgotten mercy. And in that moment, under marble and moonlight, one truth shimmered, clearer than gold: power in Rome did not rule the living, it devoured them. The summons came again before dawn. That hour, when the world forgets to breathe, and even the torches seem reluctant to burn. The boy had not yet slept. Dreams in this place were too costly, and the night had already stretched into eternity. He had learned that in Caligula's palace, no hour belonged to the living. Every footstep in the corridor was a prayer unanswered. Every whisper a prelude to disappearance. And so when the guard appeared at his door, the boy simply stood, bowed, and followed. The armor of the Praetorian clinked softly, echoing like iron heartbeats down the endless marble vein that pulsed through the imperial hill. They led him through corridors that smelled of myrrh and fear, past frescoes depicting gods, performing acts no priest dared describe. At the end of a long hall stood bronze doors, carved with images of Neptune kneeling before a man. The boy realized that even the gods here had learned obedience. When the doors opened, a wave of heat rolled out, heavy with incense and the sweet rot of overripe fruit. Inside, the emperor was awake again, surrounded by bowls of gold and bodies arranged like ornaments, each trying to appear both beautiful and terrified. Caligula sat upright, his robe the color of spilled wine, his hair damp with oil, his eyes bright with the sleepless fire of a man who had outgrown sanity. In one hand he held a slender whip, its handle wound with gold threads that glimmered under torchlight. He called it the tongue of Jupiter, and he used it to speak when words failed him. The boy knelt, his knees pressing against cold marble that had seen more blood than water. "Look up," Caligula whispered, his voice both tender and poisonous. "I want to see if Rome still knows how to fear." The boy obeyed. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world fell silent except for the hum of the torches. Then the emperor smiled, and the world resumed. Musicians began to play slow, trembling notes on lyres and flutes, a melody that sounded like a prayer losing faith. The attendants moved in rhythm, carrying trays piled high with roasted birds, figs, honey, and wine so dark it looked like shadow made liquid. No one spoke. They had all been warned this was to be a feast of silence. The emperor had decreed that tonight, no one should speak without his permission, not even to pray. Every sound belonged to him. Every breath was a tribute. The boy took his place among the servers, his hands trembling as he poured wine for senators who refused to meet his gaze. Around the table, marble statues stared down from their niches, each carved in the likeness of Caligula himself as Mars, as Apollo, as Jupiter, as something else that had no name. Their stone eyes gleamed as if amused by the living's attempt to pretend at control. The emperor raised his cup, the gold reflecting firelight onto the ceiling like rivers of blood. "Tonight," he said softly, "we dine with the gods." No one dared ask which gods he meant. The feast began in silence, the kind that roars beneath the skin. Forks trembled, wine spilled. Somewhere, a senator choked on a grape and froze in terror, unsure whether dying would offend his emperor more than coughing. Caligula watched, amused. He tapped the golden whip lightly against his palm. A rhythm no one wanted to understand. When the choking man fell forward, his head striking the table, the emperor laughed, that sharp, bright sound that turned laughter into a weapon. "See," he said to no one in particular, "even Bacchus cannot drink in my presence." Guards dragged the body away, leaving behind a dark stain that servants wiped as though erasing memory itself. The boy kept pouring, his hand steady now, because fear had burned away the part of him that trembled. He realized the rule of survival here was simple: be useful, be quiet, and never be noticed for too long. Around him, nobles smiled with frozen faces. Wives stared into cups they dared not drink from, and slaves moved like shadows trained to dance. At some unseen signal, the emperor rose. The golden whip gleamed in his hand like a sunbeam turned cruel. "The gods grow bored," he said softly, and the entire room exhaled in dread. "Shall we remind them how mortals worship?" He descended from his dais, his robe trailing across the marble like spilled wine. He touched the whip to the shoulder of a senator, then to a priest, then to a musician, each gesture a blessing that felt like a curse. Finally, his gaze found the boy. "You," he said. "Come." The boy approached, barefoot, heart hammering so loudly he feared it would betray him. Caligula handed him the whip, smiling as though giving a child a toy. "Strike the statue," he ordered, pointing toward a marble likeness of Neptune kneeling at his feet. The boy hesitated, only for a heartbeat long enough to remember the lesson from earlier days. Hesitation equals rebellion. He swung. The whip cracked against the stone, the sound echoing through the hall like thunder in a tomb. The emperor's eyes glowed with delight. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. "Even the sea obeys me now." He took the whip back, lifted his cup, and poured the remaining wine onto the floor. "The gods are thirsty," he murmured, then laughed softly to himself. "And so am I." With that, he dismissed the room. Guests scattered like frightened birds, their silks whispering against marble. Leaving behind the scent of fear and cinnamon, the boy stood motionless until the guards gestured for him to leave. Outside, the night was cool and vast, but the palace walls trapped the heat of madness inside them. Pulsing like a living heart, he returned to his quarters and sat in the dark, listening to the distant echoes of laughter, music, and something else. The faint hiss of the golden whip finding new skin. He realized then that in Caligula's world, cruelty was not punishment, it was recreation. The emperor did not destroy because he hated. He destroyed because creation bored him. The boy lay down, eyes open, watching the shadows ripple across the ceiling like waves over a drowned world. Somewhere deep in the palace, a door slammed, a woman cried out, and a song began again, the same melody. Always too slow, always too sad. When dawn came, the torches still burned, The air still smelled of blood and incense, and the boy still breathed, which in this place counted as victory. But as he closed his eyes at last, one truth whispered through his mind like a prayer the gods had forgotten to hear in Caligula's palace. Silence was not peace. It was the sound of obedience, learning to sing. By the time the sun rose over the Palatine Hill again, the boy no longer believed in morning. Light had ceased to mean safety. It only revealed what the night had tried to hide. The palace glittered as always, a monument carved out of arrogance and fear. But beneath the marble lay exhaustion, an empire's heartbeat slowed by dread. Servants moved quietly through the corridors, faces blank as masks, each one breathing the same prayer, without words, survive the day. The boy had begun to understand that here, survival was not measured in years or even months. It was counted in hours between the emperor's moods. Rumors fluttered like moths in the lamplight. Some said Caligula had spoken to the statues again, that he had found them ungrateful. Others whispered that one had wept during the Feast of Silence. Real tears, glistening on cold marble cheeks. No one dared laugh, for miracles and executions often shared the same beginning. The boy carried water through the inner halls, past columns painted with battles no soldier could remember, and paused beneath the shadow of a statue that bore the emperor's own face. The sculptor had given it the expression of divine amusement, but under the dust of incense, it seemed weary, as if even stone could grow tired of pretending to be a god. That afternoon, the palace was ordered into ceremony. A new decree had been written overnight, its ink still glistening like blood. Caligula had announced that the gods themselves had grown unworthy of worship. Their temples were to be emptied, their treasures seized, their statues brought to him for purification. Rome shall have one god, the heralds proclaimed, and he walks among men. The boy watched as porters carried images of Jupiter, Venus, and Mars into the courtyard, their faces shrouded in linen, as though ashamed. The emperor arrived soon after, barefoot, crowned with laurel, his robe trimmed in gold, so bright it hurt the eyes. He circled the statues slowly, murmuring to them as one might to traitors caught in a lie. Then he stopped before the statue of Jupiter, tall and noble, its thunderbolt raised toward the sky. Caligula reached out, touched the marble hand, and smiled with terrible affection. "You were my father once," he said softly. "But fathers grow jealous." He turned to his guards. "Break him." The sound that followed echoed through every chamber, a single crack of stone, deep and final. Like the breaking of faith, the statue fell, its head rolling across the marble with a hollow thud. Dust rose, mingling with the cries of priests who had dared to follow. Caligula watched, expression calm, as if judging a harvest. "Now," he said, "Rome is clean." The boy flinched as fragments scattered at his feet. The emperor noticed. "Do you mourn the old gods?" Caligula asked. The boy shook his head. "Good," the emperor replied, his voice almost gentle. "Then you will learn to serve the new one." That night, torches burned brighter than usual. Musicians played without rest, their hands raw from the strings, while servants rebuilt the fallen statue not as Jupiter, but as Caligula himself, seated upon a throne of thunder. The sculptors worked in silence, shaping his likeness until dawn. When they were finished, he smiled, declared it divine, and ordered them all to kneel. The boy knelt too, feeling the chill of marble seep through his skin. Days blurred into one another after that. The emperor's moods shifted with the wind. 1 hour, he blessed his attendants. The next, he demanded sacrifices to prove their loyalty. Senators were forced to present offerings at the foot of his statue rings. Jewels, and, once, a wife too beautiful to refuse. Caligula accepted each gift with a smile that made gratitude indistinguishable from cruelty. The palace became a temple now, and every corridor, an altar, priests chanted hymns written by trembling scribes who knew that a single misplaced word could end them. The boy served at these rituals, pouring wine that no one dared drink, lighting candles that flickered like nervous eyes. One evening, as twilight sank over Rome, Caligula summoned his court to the Hall of the Moon. It was a place of mirrors and silver lamps, where even shadows seemed afraid to linger. He entered wearing a cloak of pure white, his hair bound in ribbons of gold, his face painted with the calm of someone who no longer believed he could die. "Tonight," he said, "we shall see which of my children can hear the gods we have silenced." He clapped his hands, and slaves carried in bowls of water so still they reflected the ceiling like glass. "Each of you will look," he continued, "and speak the first thing you see. Truth is the only prayer I accept." One by one, they obeyed. A senator saw flames. A priest saw blood. A woman saw her own reflection and fainted. When the bowl came to the boy, he hesitated, afraid of what honesty might cost. He looked down and saw not his face, but the statue of Caligula, eyes dark and wet with something that shimmered like tears. He wanted to lie, to invent some vision of glory, but the emperor's gaze pinned him like an insect. "What do you see?" Caligula asked. The boy swallowed. "You," he whispered, "and you are weeping." The hall froze. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of breathing the cautious. Collective breath of people waiting for a god's verdict. Then Caligula laughed. It began softly, like rain against marble, then grew until the room trembled with it. "Even the stone feels pity for me," he said. Perhaps the world finally understands. He dismissed them all, except the boy. When they were alone, he approached, his eyes strangely human beneath the madness. "Do you think I weep?" "Little one," he asked. The boy did not answer. "Good," Caligula whispered, touching his shoulder. "Neither do I." After that night, the emperor avoided his statue. The sculptors whispered that he ordered it veiled, claiming it had begun to change its expression when no one watched. Servants crossed themselves when passing the hall, pretending not to hear the faint sound of dripping water that came from beneath the shroud. The boy kept his silence, but he could not forget what he had seen. The glistening lines that had run down marble cheeks. Too perfect, too alive. Perhaps it was a trick of torchlight. Perhaps not. Weeks passed. The boy served, obeyed, and breathed carefully, as though each inhale might offend the air itself. Yet sometimes, when the palace fell quiet and the moon traced its cold hand across the floors, he thought he heard the faint echo of stone crying again. And though he could not explain why, each time he heard it, a strange comfort settled in his chest, a reminder that even the most heartless gods might still be capable of sorrow. But the living, he knew, were not permitted such luxury. In Caligula's palace, the statues could weep, the servants could not. The season turned quietly, though no one in the palace dared to mention it. Outside, the olive trees bowed under the weight of ripening fruit, and the Tiber shone like liquid bronze beneath the Roman sun. But within the marble heart of Caligula's domain, time had ceased to move forward. Every dawn was the same performance. Every dusk the same exhaustion disguised as devotion. The emperor's madness had found new ground to bloom, and he tended it as carefully as a priest tending sacred fire. For now, his obsession was beauty. the kind that moved and breathed, the kind that trembled when he looked upon it. He had grown weary of statues that wept marble tears, and of priests who sang hymns he already knew by heart. He wanted something alive to adore him. He ordered a garden built upon the eastern terrace, a place where the living could become decoration. No expense was spared. The walls were carved from white stone that shimmered under torchlight like frozen milk. Pools reflected the sky, and fountains whispered in patterns that sounded like laughter if one listened too long. But beneath its beauty, the garden breathed uneasily. Slaves planted lilies and roses in soil mixed with ashes from burnt offerings, while musicians rehearsed soft melodies to charm the emperor's restless nights. Caligula named it the Garden of Shadows and declared it his sanctuary, though everyone knew it was a stage built for cruelty disguised as grace. On the night of its consecration, the emperor appeared dressed in silver, his robe trailing like spilled moonlight. The courtiers followed him in silence, their faces pale beneath the flicker of oil lamps. The boy walked among them, carrying a bowl of fragrant smoke that curled upward, hiding their unease. Caligula smiled at the gathered assembly, eyes reflecting the torches like twin shards of polished obsidian. "Tonight," he said softly, "I dedicate this garden to what Rome has forgotten, to beauty that obeys." His hand drifted through the air, fingers brushing the petals of a rose that had been dyed gold for the occasion. The flower bent beneath his touch, trembling as if alive. Musicians began to play. Their instruments sang gently, a lullaby threaded with fear. Women draped in silk moved through the garden, their steps slow and measured, their faces painted white to resemble the marble nymphs standing among the trees. They were living statues now, chosen for their stillness, their perfect silence. The emperor watched them with fascination, occasionally reaching out to tilt a chin or adjust a strand of hair. When one flinched, he smiled, not in anger, but in pleasure, as though imperfections were proof of their humanity, and therefore his own divinity. The boy stood at the edge of the pool, pouring oil into the water until it shimmered like a second sky. From where he knelt, he could see the emperor's reflection ripple with every step, multiplied by the torches into endless versions of himself. The music grew softer, dissolving into whispers of wind through leaves. One of the living statues, a girl with hair black as night, began to sing. Her voice rose fragile and pure, trembling like glass. The song was about the moon's sorrow, about a goddess who fell in love with the earth and could never touch it again. The melody drifted upward, wrapping around the torches, the fountains, and every terrified heart in the garden. For a moment, even Caligula seemed human. His eyes softened, and he raised his hand as if catching the sound before it escaped. But then, as quickly as the tenderness came, it vanished. His expression hardened, and the air seemed to thicken with unease. "Why sorrow?" he murmured. "Why should the moon grieve when she can command tides?" The girl faltered, unsure whether to continue. The emperor stepped closer, the gold-threaded sandals whispering against the stone. "Finish it," he said, his voice calm but edged with something dangerous. She swallowed, lifted her gaze to the sky, and began again, though her voice now trembled like a candle in wind. Halfway through the final verse, the song broke. Perhaps from fear, perhaps from tears, or perhaps from the simple exhaustion of existing under divine eyes. Silence fell like a blade. Caligula stood motionless, then tilted his head slightly, the way a cat studies the last flicker of a trapped bird. "Why did you stop?" he asked. The girl dropped to her knees, whispering that the goddess in the song had no more words. The emperor smiled faintly. Then she should have borrowed mine. And with that, he turned to the boy. "Bring me the water." The boy obeyed, heart hammering. He lifted the bowl, and Caligula dipped his fingers into the scented liquid. Droplets fell onto the girl's shoulders, sliding down her skin like tears. "You sang beautifully," he said gently. "Too beautifully to be human." He gestured to the guards. "Place her among the statues. Let her rest in marble." The musicians froze. The guests lowered their heads. The boy bit his tongue to keep from crying out as the guards led her away toward the sculptor's hall, where beauty was preserved through petrification. The emperor watched her go, then turned back to his garden, eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Now the song is complete," he said. After the feast ended, the guests dispersed in frightened silence. The garden glowed under the moonlight, filled with flowers, fountains, and one less voice. The boy lingered behind, gathering scattered petals from the stones. He noticed that the torches cast strange shapes on the walls, shadows that moved against the direction of the light, slow and deliberate, as if something unseen still wandered between the trees. He tried to ignore it, but as he turned to leave, he heard a faint sound, a single note, distant and trembling, like the echo of the unfinished song. He stopped. The sound came again, rising softly from the far end of the garden where the statue hall stood. He followed it through the cool air, past the fountains and roses, until he reached the colonnade. There, beneath a half-finished statue covered in a sheet of linen, the song continued low, broken, but unmistakably alive. The boy's breath caught. He knew he should flee, but his feet refused to move. The melody curled around him, gentle as a whisper, then faded. When he lifted the sheet, there was nothing underneath but marble dust, and a single golden rose, glistening as if wet with tears. He did not tell anyone what he had seen. In the palace, silence was not merely safety, it was survival. Yet from that night onward, every time he passed the garden, he felt the shadows shift, as though the statues turned their faces toward him when he wasn't looking. And when the wind blew through the corridors, he sometimes heard that same melody drifting through the dark, unfinished and eternal, as if the song no one dared finish had found its way into the breath of the palace itself. By morning, Caligula declared the garden his masterpiece, the only place in Rome where gods could walk among their own perfection. But the servants who cleaned its marble paths whispered a different truth. They said that when the emperor slept, the statues moved their lips, that they sang to the moon, soft and sorrowful, completing the song that had once been silenced. The boy never listened too closely, for in this palace, the hearing was a kind of guilt, and guilt, like beauty, rarely survived until dawn. The garden was never silent again after that night. Its fountains whispered the melody of the lost girl. Its statues gleamed with dampness that could never be explained. And those who passed by at dusk swore that the air itself trembled with music. No musician played. But Caligula, restless in his divinity, soon grew bored of beauty that only reflected obedience. He craved a new stage, one not made of marble and roses but of light and reflection. He commanded his architects to build a room where he could see himself multiplied, where even the gods would have to acknowledge how magnificent he was. And so the Chamber of Mirrors was born, hidden deep within the palace, lit by torches that burned blue and gold. Their flames reflected endlessly until the walls seemed to vanish into eternity. The construction took only 12 days, for the workers had learned that hesitation cost more than life. They worked by night, polishing the walls with silver dust and fragments of obsidian until the emperor could see himself in every direction. When it was finished, Caligula stood at its center, surrounded by 1,000 shimmering versions of himself, each one watching, smiling, judging, adoring. He laughed, a sound that filled the room and came back multiplied. A chorus of his own madness, echoing in perfect harmony. "Now," he whispered, "I am never alone." The boy was summoned to attend him there, carrying a jug of wine so dark it looked like the reflection of blood. As he poured, he tried not to look at the walls, but his eyes betrayed him. Everywhere he turned, he saw Caligula, his face, his eyes, his grin rippling across the glass like water disturbed by a storm. The emperor noticed. "Beautiful, is it not?" he murmured. "1,000 Caesars. All divine. All perfect." He ran his fingers along the glass, leaving streaks of oil and heat. "Do you know why gods fear mirrors?" he asked. The boy shook his head. Caligula smiled faintly. "Because they show us what even we cannot control." He lifted the cup and drank deeply, red staining his lips. Then he gestured for the boy to stay, to witness whatever performance he had prepared for the night. "Tonight," he said, "we will see if death recognizes me." At first, the boy thought he had misheard. But then he saw what lay upon the marble table daggers, each identical, their hilts engraved with serpents, their blades so polished. They too reflected the emperor's face. Caligula picked one up, turning it over in his hand as if admiring its craftsmanship. "Do you know what I envy most about mortals?" he asked softly. "They get to die. They escape themselves. But I am trapped in eternity. Even the stars cannot weep for me." He smiled, but there was something in the curve of it that resembled sorrow. Then he raised the dagger and pressed it against his chest. Just below the heart, the boy gasped, but Caligula only laughed. "No, child, not tonight. I merely wish to see if the god bleeds." He drew the blade across his skin, not deep, but enough for crimson to bloom like a flower on white linen. The reflections multiplied it until the chamber looked drenched in blood. The emperor stared at his wound, then at the 1,000 identical wounds shimmering around him, and whispered, "See, even pain obeys me." He let the dagger fall, its sound echoing endlessly. "But death," he added, "still heedeth." He turned toward the boy. "Do you think I can die?" The boy could not speak. The emperor's eyes softened. "Good. Neither do I." From that night forward, Caligula spent every evening inside the Chamber of Mirrors. He would enter alone, bringing only wine, candles, and silence. Those who guarded the door said they could hear him speaking to his reflections, arguing with them, laughing with them, sometimes weeping. At times he would emerge at dawn with new proclamations, stranger, darker, more impossible than before. He decreed that he had spoken with his own soul, that the gods had confessed their envy, that Jupiter himself had begged forgiveness for existing before him. The courtiers applauded, though their applause trembled like leaves in wind. One evening, the emperor summoned senators, priests, and servants into the chamber. The boy was there too, standing near the entrance, holding a torch that trembled, despite his effort to steady it. Caligula addressed the assembly with a calm that felt more dangerous than rage. "You have all looked upon me," he said, "but none have truly seen me. Tonight you will witness eternity." He clapped his hands, and attendants unveiled mirrors on every wall, ceiling, and column. The room became a universe of endless Caesars, stretching in all directions, each reflection shimmering with divine arrogance. "You see," he whispered, "even the void worships me." He began to pace slowly, his reflection pacing with him, infinite and precise. Then he stopped before a senator and asked, "Which of us is real?" The man stammered, sweat shining on his brow. You, divinity. Caligula laughed, pointing to the mirror. That one said it first. The guests laughed nervously, not knowing whether it was safe. The emperor raised his hand for silence. We are all reflections, he said softly, but only I decide which image lives. He turned to his guards. Remove the shadows. No one knew what he meant until one of the senators cried out. Guards seized him and dragged him into the center of the chamber. Caligula approached, whispering something that made the man collapse into sobs. Then he raised the fallen dagger and held it before the mirror. Watch, he said. Let the reflection die first. He thrust the blade forward, not into the senator, but into the mirror itself. The glass shattered with a sound like thunder, fragments raining down in a storm of silver. The reflection splintered, breaking into 1,000 wounded faces. Now, Caligula said softly, let the man follow. The boy turned away before the scream finished. When he looked again, the marble was red, and the emperor was smiling, as though satisfied with some cosmic equation finally solved. The mirror dies. The man dies, he murmured. Therefore, I am the mirror that cannot break. He turned to the boy, eyes gleaming with feverish triumph. Do you see? Little one, even death worships me now. After that night, no one entered the chamber of mirrors again, except Caligula himself. The doors were sealed when he emerged, and servants were forbidden to clean within. But sometimes, when the torches burned low and the palace fell into uneasy sleep, faint sounds came from behind those silvered walls. Laughter, whispers, sometimes even the echo of shattering glass. The boy tried not to listen, yet the sound crept through his dreams until he could no longer tell if he was awake. One morning, as the sun poured through the colonnades, the emperor appeared before his court with a new decree. Death is only disobedience in disguise. He announced that he would conquer it, not by living forever, but by dying each night and returning reborn. The courtiers applauded through trembling smiles, unsure whether this was metaphor or madness. The boy, standing among them, watched the emperor's blood-stained robe glimmer under daylight, and thought how strange it was that the god who feared nothing seemed most terrified of himself. That night, as torches flickered along the halls, Caligula vanished into the chamber of mirrors once more. The boy waited outside until dawn, hearing only faint laughter and the clink of metal. When at last the door opened, the emperor emerged pale and trembling, whispering, "I have seen him, the one who wears my face." He smiled at the boy, eyes hollow as glass. "I killed him," he said softly, "and tomorrow he will kill me." Then he walked away, leaving the scent of wine and smoke behind. And the boy realized with a chill that in Caligula's world, death was not the end. It was merely rehearsal. The morning after the emperor's strange declaration, Rome awoke beneath a sky the color of bronze. Clouds drifted low over the city, heavy as thoughts that dared not be spoken, and the Palatine Hill seemed to glow faintly, as though the stones themselves had begun to smolder. In the palace, servants whispered that the emperor had not slept again, that he had wandered barefoot through the corridors until dawn, trailing candle wax and muttering about gods who hid from him in his own reflection. The boy had grown used to such whispers. They were part of the air now, carried through every hall like invisible smoke. But that morning felt different. The air itself trembled, and even the birds that nested along the marble roofs refused to sing. Caligula appeared at midday, radiant and terrible. He was dressed in crimson, a color that seemed to drink the light around him. His crown was made of small bones, polished to ivory gleam, and his eyes shone with the clarity of someone who had not slept in several lifetimes. He announced, with a voice both serene and ecstatic, that Rome was to witness a new ceremony, one that would honor not the gods above, but the God within the flesh, will worship life, he said softly, and all life ends in me. The courtiers murmured their approval, though their faces betrayed the exhaustion of people who had forgotten what true silence sounded like. The emperor's smile widened. "Tonight," he continued, "we shall dine with the ancestors. The living and the dead shall feast together, and no one will leave hungry." By sunset, the great hall had been transformed into a theatre of reverence and dread. Marble tables stretched from one end of the room to the other, covered in gold cloth that shimmered beneath hundreds of torches. Silver bowls overflowed with pomegranates and grapes, and roasted birds gleamed with honey glaze. But what drew every eye were the figures seated among the guests, statues cast in wax and bronze, painted to resemble the dead emperors of old. Augustus, Tiberius, and even Julius himself seemed to sit once more among the living, their eyes made of glass, their faces frozen in eternal applause. Between them sat Caligula, radiant and still, as if he too had been carved from something not entirely human. The boy stood at his usual place near the table's edge, ready to serve, but unable to look away. The emperor lifted his cup and gestured to the silent effigies beside him. "Behold," he said, "our forefathers return to honor their heir. The empire does not die, it multiplies." He raised the cup higher, letting the red wine catch the torchlight. "To Rome, and to eternity." The courtiers echoed the toast, their voices trembling as though afraid to be the first to fall silent. The musicians began to play, their melody soft and uncertain, as if even sound hesitated to exist here. The feast began. The emperor ordered that each dish be presented twice, once to the living and once to the dead. Servants approached the waxen emperors with trembling hands, laying platters before them, then retreating as though expecting movement. And sometimes, the boy swore he saw it, the faint shift of a waxen finger, the almost imperceptible turn of a bronze head. Perhaps it was the heat from the torches, or perhaps the dead, like the living, obeyed Caligula's will, even in silence. Hours passed in a strange rhythm of laughter and dread. Caligula spoke freely now, addressing the statues as if they were senators, chiding one for cowardice, praising another for vision. He asked them questions, and when they did not reply, he smiled as though they had. "Ah, my beloved ancestors," he said, "you feared me once, but see how eternity kneels at my table." He turned to his guests. "Do you not envy them? They no longer hunger. They no longer tremble. Their devotion is perfect." A senator tried to answer, but the emperor silenced him with a raised hand. "No," he whispered. "Tonight only the dead may speak." At his signal, the musicians stopped. The room fell utterly still, save for the soft hiss of torches and the beating of 1,000 terrified hearts. Then, from somewhere deep within the hall, came a sound. No one could explain. It was low, hollow, and rhythmic, like the slow turning of a millstone, or the grinding of marble against marble. The guests looked at one another in horror. Caligula smiled. "They are answering," he said. "They remember." He rose from his seat, his crimson robe brushing the floor like a shadow untethered. "Bring them closer," he commanded, and guards obeyed, pushing the wax figures forward until they stood among the living. The boy felt the temperature drop, the air thick with the scent of melting wax and wine. Caligula extended his hand toward one of the figures, Julius, the eternal conqueror, and whispered, "Speak." "In Father, tell them how the gods are born." The candles flickered. A drop of melted wax slid from the statue's mouth and struck the table with a hiss. Someone screamed. Caligula turned toward the sound and laughed. You see, even silence bleeds. The feast collapsed into chaos after that. Guests stumbled backward, spilling wine and fear across the marble. Musicians fled, their instruments clattering to the ground. The boy stood frozen, watching as the emperor strode among them like a priest of some ancient and cruel faith. He dipped his fingers into the spilled wine and smeared it across his face like war paint. "Do not run," he cried. "Do not hide from the miracle tonight. The dead have dined, and you, my children, you have been chosen to join them." The guards hesitated. They were trained to obey, but even obedience faltered when madness became prophecy. Caligula's laughter echoed, sharp and beautiful. As he climbed onto the table, stepping over dishes and spilled blood alike, "Rome breathes through me," he shouted. "And tonight, I breathe it back." He raised his arms to the ceiling, where smoke coiled like ghosts escaping through cracks in heaven. The torches dimmed, their flames shrinking as if in fear. The boy dropped to his knees, covering his ears as the emperor's voice rose to a scream that was not entirely human. Then, silence. When the boy dared to look again, Caligula was gone. The wax figures sat motionless, their eyes dull, their painted lips sealed. The guests were gone too, escorted or erased. He did not know which. Only the boy remained, kneeling beside overturned goblets and cold food. Somewhere far above, the moon broke free from the clouds and sent a single pale beam through the open roof. It fell upon the emperor's empty throne, upon the bones that decorated its arms, and upon the half-melted effigies that gleamed like ghosts of ambition. The boy rose slowly, his body trembling with exhaustion. That night, the palace slept as though the air itself had been drugged. Even the guards dared not speak of what had happened, but Rome did not sleep. The city below the hill felt the weight of something invisible pressing upon it. The dogs refused to howl. The river ran thick and silent, and mothers woke their children only to hold them tighter, though they could not say why. It was as if the empire itself had drawn a single, shuddering breath and forgotten how to release it. The boy sat awake until dawn, staring at the horizon where the first hint of light touched the rooftops. The palace around him was still, yet he could feel its pulse beneath the marble, slow and heavy, like a heart that refused to die. Somewhere deep within those endless corridors, Caligula still walked, whispering to the dead, hosting a feast no one dared to end. And as the first rays of sun spilled across Rome, the boy whispered the only prayer he still remembered: "Let the gods sleep, just for one day." The sun rose on a city pretending it had not been awake all night. The forum buzzed with the ordinary noises of trade and prayer, but there was something hollow in the rhythm of Rome's heartbeat that morning, as if the empire itself were listening for footsteps on marble far above. The boy walked among the servants, silent as ever, carrying jugs of oil and trays of fruit through corridors that smelled faintly of smoke and wax. No one spoke of the banquet of bones. To mention it aloud would have been to summon it again, and no one wished to see what might answer. Yet traces of it lingered everywhere, the scent of burning honey, the faint stains of crimson along the floor, and the silence of musicians who no longer played. Caligula had vanished for 2 days after that terrible feast, and whispers grew wild in his absence. Some said he had gone to the Tiber to baptize himself in the blood of Rome. Others swore he had locked himself within the chamber of mirrors, speaking to reflections that no longer answered him. But on the third night, when the moon was a thin blade above the city, he returned, The emperor appeared at supper without announcement, his robe white again, his voice calm, his smile too gentle to be trusted. He declared that the gods had forgiven him, that the dead had tasted glory and fallen silent in approval, and that Rome would now know peace. The courtiers applauded, though their palms were slick with sweat. The boy bowed low and prayed that peace, like most of Caligula's promises, would last no longer than a heartbeat. But the emperor was a man of endless invention, and his mind could not rest. He grew fascinated with purification, with the idea that water could cleanse not just the body but the soul. He ordered the architects to build a new bathhouse within the palace, one grander than any temple. Marble was brought from Greece, silver pipes from Egypt, and perfumes from lands whose names the servants could barely pronounce. The baths would flow, he said, with the water of heaven itself, and when they were finished, Rome would finally see what holiness looked like in flesh. The construction took weeks, and when it was done, the bath was unlike anything the empire had ever known. Steam rose from its surface like incense. The walls were painted with scenes of rebirth and glory, Caligula rising from the sea, surrounded by dolphins and angels. The water shimmered with oil and crushed petals, glowing faintly as if lit from within. He called it the River of Perfume, and he invited only a chosen few to bathe in it, his generals, his priests, and a handful of attendants whose beauty pleased him. The boy was chosen to serve among them, to pour the oils, to carry the towels woven with threads of gold, to stand so close to the divine body that the scent of the emperor would linger on his skin for days. The first ceremony took place at twilight. The emperor stepped into the bath as the last light faded, his body gleaming beneath the flickering torches. He closed his eyes and murmured prayers that no priest recognized. Words twisted between Latin and something older, heavier. "The gods sleep," he whispered, "but I shall wake them in water." He poured perfume over his head until it ran down his chest like molten amber. The courtiers knelt at the pool's edge, whispering praises, pretending not to tremble. The boy poured more oil into the water, watching as it spread in rippling circles that distorted the emperor's reflection. Beneath the fragrance, something sour lingered, the faint, metallic scent of blood. That night, as the attendants drained the pool, the boy noticed something strange. The water, once clear, had turned faintly red. He said nothing, only bowed and followed orders. But when he passed through the lower chambers, where the water pipes descended into the earth, he heard sounds that did not belong in a bathhouse, soft voices, coughing, and the clatter of chains. He followed the echoes until he reached a narrow archway guarded by two soldiers who stared ahead with eyes that refused to see. Behind them was a door, carved with the imperial crest. The boy knew better than to ask questions, but curiosity was a hunger that even fear could not always starve. A few days later, as he carried fresh linens through the corridor, he found the door ajar. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, and a faint glow pulsed from below. He descended a flight of stairs, each step colder than the last, until he reached a cavern beneath the bath. There, by the light of oil lamps, he saw what the River of Perfume truly concealed. A narrow canal ran beneath the marble floor, and within it lay a row of chained figures, their faces pale and vacant, their bodies half submerged in water that shimmered with the same oils used in the emperor's baths. They were prisoners, men and women taken from the streets, from the temples, from the prisons of Rome. Their wrists were bound to iron rings, and their lips moved without sound, as if reciting prayers that had lost their words. The boy stared, heart frozen in his chest. One of them, an old man with white hair plastered to his face, turned his eyes upward. "Do not speak," he mouthed, though no sound came. "He listens through the water." The boy fled, stumbling back up the stairs until he reached the safety of torchlight. He never spoke of what he had seen, but that night he dreamed of crimson waves, of hands reaching from beneath the surface, of the Emperor's laughter echoing through the water like thunder trapped beneath glass. From then on, he could not look at the baths without seeing ghosts. Yet Caligula grew more radiant by the day, his skin glowing with an unnatural sheen, his laughter echoing louder than ever. He proclaimed that the waters had made him immortal. "I have bathed in the breath of the gods," he said. "No blade shall wound me. No shadow shall claim me." He commanded the senators to bathe as well, to share his gift. Many obeyed, stepping into the perfumed water with trembling legs, emerging pale and speechless. Those who refused were invited to watch, and those who watched too closely were never seen again. The boy avoided the lower corridors, but at night he could still hear the faint drip of water behind the walls, the sighing of unseen mouths below. Sometimes the pipes groaned as if something inside them struggled to breathe. The servants whispered that the Emperor's immortality had a price, that the prisoners beneath the bath had become offerings, their lives slowly distilled into perfume. When Caligula bathed, the water grew warmer, as though fed by their fading heat. He called it sanctification. They called it punishment. One morning, while the Emperor slept, the boy crept to the pool and stared at his own reflection. The water was calm, the scent of roses thick enough to sting his eyes. For a moment, he thought he saw his face ripple, not from movement, but from something beneath it, a shape, faint and human, rising toward him. He reached out, trembling, but before his fingers touched the surface, the reflection changed. Caligula's face looked back at him. Smiling, the boy stumbled backward, heart pounding, and fled before the ripples could settle. That night, as Rome slept and the palace murmured in its dreams, the boy lay awake, listening to the faint rush of water through the pipes. It sounded almost like a heartbeat, slow and patient, pulsing beneath the marble floor. He wondered how long the Emperor's river could flow before it ran out of souls to drink. And somewhere beneath that perfumed silence, he thought he heard the old man's voice again, whispering through the pipes like wind through bones. The water remembers. The river of perfume did not dry, but it began to thicken, and the scent that once filled the palace with sweetness turned sour, like flowers left too long on a grave. Servants moved through the halls with cloth pressed to their faces, pretending it was incense and not decay that followed them. The Emperor's bath gleamed as always, yet its glow had grown strange redder, heavier, as if the light beneath the water no longer came from torches but from something alive and restless below. The boy had learned not to look at it for long. The ripples sometimes formed shapes that should not have existed, but Caligula was radiant. He claimed that the gods had at last revealed their secret to him, that immortality had entered his veins, that he could feel the pulse of Rome beating inside his chest. He said he had become the empire's heart, and if he stopped beating, so would the world. In those days, his hunger changed. He no longer desired wine or women or laughter. He wanted devotion that burned. He wanted worship that consumed itself. He began to speak of purification by fire, the only element, he said, powerful enough to crown a god. Water cleanses, he told his court, but fire remembers. And so he announced another celebration, one that would surpass the banquet of bones and the river of perfume combined. He named it the Feast of Ashes, a ceremony to prove that Rome could be reborn from its own ruin. The courtiers applauded, though many of them had begun to look like ghosts, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights, their smiles carved too deep to be real. The boy bowed, but his hands shook as he poured the emperor's wine. Preparations began at once. Carpenters built a grand pyre in the center of the palace courtyard, layered with cedar and olive branches, soaked in oil and wrapped with garlands of gold. The emperor decreed that no animal would be sacrificed that night, for he required only what was pure. The servants did not know what he meant until the soldiers began dragging prisoners from the dungeons. Men and women accused of disloyalty, their wrists bound, their eyes glazed with the knowledge that they had been chosen. Caligula called them the unworthy, and he ordered them placed around the pyre like offerings awaiting their gods. The boy tried not to look, but their silence followed him through the corridors like the sound of wind before a storm. The night of the feast came heavy with heat. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. The emperor appeared dressed in white again. Those streaks of crimson ran through the fabric like veins of marble. He wore no crown this time, only a ring of olive leaves dipped in oil. "Tonight," he said, his voice low but clear, "Rome will see what it means to rise from death." He stepped onto the dais beside the pyre, where the prisoners knelt in a circle, and raised his hands toward the sky. The flames were waiting, silent, patient. The boy stood among the attendants, his heart thudding so loud he was sure it could be heard. Caligula spoke to the heavens as though they owed him an answer. "You gave fire to mortals, Prometheus," he said, "but you never gave it to gods. Tonight, I take back what was stolen." He lifted a torch and touched it to the pyre. The wood caught instantly, roaring upward with a sound like applause. The air filled with smoke, perfume, and something else. The sharp, choking sweetness of burning oil. The emperor's face glowed in the light, his eyes reflecting the blaze like molten gold. "Behold," he cried, "even destruction serves me." The flames rose higher, twisting into shapes that looked almost human. The boy thought he saw faces forming in the fire, some familiar, some lost to memory. They did not scream. They simply watched, as if waiting for something. Caligula laughed and spread his arms wide, stepping closer to the pyre until the heat rippled against his robe. "You see," he shouted to the crowd, "they do not resist. They become—" His voice grew softer then, trembling with awe. "I have made them eternal." The music began again, slow and solemn, drums beating like a giant heart. The courtiers chanted his name, each repetition softer than the last, until the sound blended with the crackle of the fire. The boy felt the air press against his skin, heavy with heat and dread. The emperor turned toward him suddenly, eyes bright as a dying star. "You, child," he said, "do you understand what you witness?" The boy bowed low, unable to speak. "You see," Caligula continued, "how easily the flesh yields to light, how even suffering becomes art." He reached into the fire with one hand, and when he drew it back, his skin was unburned. The crowd gasped. The emperor smiled. "The gods have given me proof," he whispered. "I cannot die." But then something strange happened. The fire, which had roared so fiercely, began to bend inward, its flames turning blue at the edges. The smoke thickened, dark as ink, and through it, a shape began to form, a figure rising from the heart of the pyre, taller than any man, made of smoke and light. The boy saw its outline clearly, shoulders broad, head bowed, eyes like hollow suns. It moved without sound, its gaze fixed on the emperor. The courtiers fell silent. Even the torches seemed to shrink. Caligula stared, his smile faltering for the first time. "Who are you?" he whispered. The figure did not answer, but its shadow stretched across the courtyard, swallowing the light. Then it spoke, though the voice did not come from the air but from inside every skull present, vibrating through bone and thought alike. "You called. My son," it said, "and I came." The emperor staggered backward. "Father," he breathed. The voice echoed, deeper now. "You wear my crown and my name, but not my mercy. You burned what was mine." The flames surged again, red and violent, throwing sparks into the night sky. Caligula fell to his knees, trembling, and the crowd did not dare move. "I have no father," he shouted. "I am God." The figure leaned closer, its face dissolving into smoke. "Then be one," it whispered, "and burn alone." The fire collapsed inward with a thunderous roar, scattering ash across the courtyard like rain. When the smoke cleared, the figure was gone, and so were the prisoners. Only a mound of grey dust remained where the pyre had stood. Caligula rose slowly, his robe blackened, his hair clinging to his face. He looked around at his silent court, eyes wide with triumph and terror. "You saw it," he murmured. "You saw him bow before me." No one spoke. The boy met his gaze for a single moment, and saw in those eyes something beyond madness, a kind of grief so deep it had forgotten what it grieved for. That night, the emperor ordered the ashes gathered into golden urns and placed in the temple hall. He called them relics of divinity, proof that Rome had touched the heavens. But the servants whispered that when the torches went out, the urns trembled softly, as if something inside still breathed. The boy, carrying one of them, felt the warmth of it through the gold and nearly dropped it. He thought he heard a whisper, a voice, faint as wind through smoke, say his name. In the days that followed, the emperor rarely left his chamber. He spoke to no one, though sometimes laughter drifted from behind the door, followed by weeping. The palace grew darker, the torches burning low, the scent of ash lingering in every breath. Rome carried on as it always had, building, trading, killing, but the boy knew something had shifted. The shadow that had called the emperor's son still wandered somewhere unseen, and the god of Rome had begun to fear the dark. The palace had begun to decay from within, though its marble walls gleamed brighter than ever, as if trying to convince the world that perfection could not rot. Servants still polished the floors and lit the torches, but no one sang while they worked. The air was heavy with incense that masked the smell of burnt oil and old perfume, and the fountains of the Garden of Shadows now ran with water the color of tarnished gold. Caligula had withdrawn from the eyes of his empire. He no longer presided over councils or parades. His voice, once the thunder of Rome, had turned into a whisper that echoed behind closed doors. The boy saw him only from a distance, now thin, pale, and restless, pacing through corridors as though searching for something he had misplaced. Rumor said he no longer slept in his own bed, but among the urns of ashes he called divine relics, speaking to them as if they were companions. One morning, before the sun rose, a herald's cry shattered the quiet. The emperor had ordered a funeral not for a man, not for a god, but for the concept of mortality itself. Rome, the decree announced, shall bury death, for I have conquered it. The courtiers assembled in silence, too frightened to question the logic of this new ceremony. Sculptors were commanded to carve a coffin from pure white marble, larger than a chariot, lined with silk and veiled in gold dust. The coffin, Caligula said, would contain the bones of all things that dared to die. When someone asked what would fill it, the emperor smiled thinly and replied, whatever the world no longer needs. The funeral procession began at dusk. The sky was an iron sheet, and the sun bled its last light into the Tiber. Caligula led the march barefoot, wearing a robe of black so deep it seemed to swallow the firelight around him. He carried in his hands a small box of silver, saying it held the final breath of the last mortal man. Behind him came senators and priests, followed by slaves carrying torches and urns of ashes from the feast of fire. The boy walked among them, his eyes fixed on the ground, afraid that if he looked up, he might see the same shadow that had once risen from the flames. The path led to the center of the palace courtyard, where the marble coffin waited upon a dais surrounded by lilies and white doves that refused to fly. The emperor placed the silver box within and gestured for the priests to begin their chant. Their voices rose and fell like waves, a hymn both mournful and triumphant. Here lies death, they sang. Defeated by Caesar divine, Caligula lifted his face to the darkening sky. Do you hear that? Jupiter, he shouted, your reign is over. Even your thunder will one day kneel before me. The torches flickered, though no wind stirred. The boy felt the temperature drop, the air growing heavy with something unseen. Caligula turned toward his court and smiled. A brittle, exhausted smile that made the boy's blood run cold. Witness, he whispered, the rebirth of Rome. Tonight we bury the last enemy. He knelt beside the coffin and scattered a handful of ashes inside. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Then the ground beneath them trembled not with the grandeur of divine power, but with the slow, sick shudder of something ancient disturbed in its rest. A faint crack spread across the coffin's lid. The priests gasped. One dropped his torch, which went out with a hiss. Caligula's smile wavered, but pride forced it back into place. It is only the earth applauding, he said. But the boy saw what the emperor refused to see. The crack widened, splitting the marble like bone under pressure. A low sound rose from within, not a voice, not even a whisper, but a sigh so deep it seemed to come from the stone itself. The doves took flight at last, their wings beating frantically into the darkening sky. The priests fell silent. Then, without warning, every torch in the courtyard extinguished at once. Darkness swallowed the palace. The boy's breath caught in his throat, and for a long moment there was no sound at all, only the slow creak of marble shifting under unseen weight. When light returned, it came not from fire, but from the moon rising over the palace roof. Enormous and pale as bone, Caligula looked up, exhaling as if relieved. But his expression froze. The moon had not stopped rising, it had stopped moving altogether. It hung in the sky like a suspended coin, neither bright nor dim, its light motionless. Rome held its breath. The emperor whispered something the boy could not hear. Then he climbed onto the dais, his face lit ghostly white by the frozen moon. Even she pauses to watch me, he said. Even the heavens wait. He placed his hands upon the cracked coffin. Do not fear. My children, the dead know their master. The moment he spoke, the sigh from within grew louder, and the crack split open completely. A gust of cold air surged outward, scattering lilies across the stones. The boy staggered back as something shimmered inside the coffin ash, rising in a spiral, glowing faintly like dust caught in light. Caligula stared into the swirling ash, eyes wide with wonder. It moves, he murmured. It breathes. The ash gathered, forming shapes, faces, hands, fragments of bodies that flickered and vanished before they could take form. They thank me, he said softly. They come to kiss their savior. He reached into the coffin, and the ash clung to his skin like smoke. His laughter broke the silence. "You see, they cannot let me go." He turned toward the crowd, his arms outstretched, his body dusted with grey. "Look upon me. Rome, even the dead are my disciples." But the laughter died quickly. The ash on his arms began to darken, spreading up his skin like ink, seeping through paper. The emperor looked down, confusion dawning in his eyes. "What is this?" he whispered. The shadows deepened, climbing his throat, his cheeks, his face. The boy wanted to run, but found his legs frozen. Caligula gasped, clawing at his skin, as though trying to peel the darkness away. "No," he breathed. "You were mine." The shadows answered not in words, but in the same sigh that had come from the coffin. Deeper now, heavier, it wrapped around him like smoke, and in the span of a breath, the emperor vanished within it. The moon above flickered once and went out, plunging the courtyard into total darkness. Panic rippled through the crowd. Priests screamed prayers, courtiers fled, and soldiers dropped their torches as they stumbled toward the gates. The boy fell to his knees. Pressing his hands against the cold stone, he heard the whisper again, the same voice that had once spoken from the fire. He burned still. Then came silence. When dawn finally arrived, the moon was gone, and the courtyard was empty. The marble coffin lay in ruins, its lid shattered, its contents nothing but fine grey dust scattered by the wind. Caligula was nowhere to be found. Some said he had ascended, others that he had been swallowed by his own miracle. The Senate would later call it disappearance. The servants called it deliverance. The boy, however, knew it was neither. That night had not ended. It merely waited. In the days that followed, the palace grew quieter. The guards whispered that the emperor had become a shadow that walked the halls at night, leaving footprints of ash. The boy sometimes thought he saw him reflected in the polished marble, standing behind him, silent, watching, and once, in the stillness before dawn, he heard footsteps approach, slow and deliberate. When he turned, no one was there, but a single grey handprint marked the wall beside his bed. The air smelled faintly of perfume and dust. He did not scream. He simply bowed his head and whispered, "Sleep now, Caesar." But the silence that answered him was too alive to be sleep. The days that followed the marble funeral blurred together, each dawn a pale imitation of the one before. No one spoke the emperor's name aloud anymore, though his absence felt heavier than his presence had ever been. The senators met in silence, pretending to govern, while the city below the hill tried to forget that its god had vanished without dying. But the palace could not forget. The walls themselves remembered. They breathed. They whispered. And those who lived within them began to change. Servants walked slower, as if the marble beneath their feet had grown thick and weary. Musicians stopped playing. Their instruments produced strange, hollow tones, as though echoing from a place that no longer existed. The boy moved like a ghost through these corridors of memory. He was older now, though he could not have said how much time had passed. The seasons no longer meant anything in Caligula's Rome. There was only light and shadow, incense and fear. At night, the torches burned lower, and the palace exhaled, faint sighs that rose from its stones, like breath from a sleeping giant. Sometimes, in that half-silence between dreams, he could almost hear voices low, murmuring, endless. They spoke in Latin, in Greek, in tongues too old to name. They did not speak to him, but through him, filling the air with fragments of a story that refused to end. One evening, while carrying a tray through the northern hall, The boy stopped. The whispering was louder there, woven into the marble itself. He pressed his ear against the wall and felt vibrations soft, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable command. It was the Emperor's voice. "Build," it said. "Remember me." The boy staggered backward, spilling wine across the floor. The dark liquid ran along the tiles, forming lines that resembled writing, curling into shapes like letters. For a moment he thought he saw them glow. Then the sound stopped, and the silence felt worse. The next morning, the architects arrived without orders. They claimed to have received divine dreams, instructing them to extend the palace further toward the forum. "He demands a new wing," one whispered. "A place where the walls may speak without echo." None questioned whose will they served. The emperor might have vanished, but his command lingered like perfume on an empty throne. So they built day and night, with trembling hands, using stone quarried from hills where the earth still smelled of fire. The construction made no sense. The halls led nowhere. The rooms looped back upon themselves. Stairways ended at ceilings. Doors opened to walls. It was less a palace than a labyrinth, a monument to confusion. But the workers obeyed. Driven by fear and dreams, they could not escape. The boy watched it grow from the shadows. He realized that the more the builders worked, the less human they seemed. Their eyes dulled. Their skin turned pale. Their mouths moved, as if reciting prayers they no longer understood. He tried speaking to one of them, a mason who had once sung to his tools as he worked. The man turned toward him, face expressionless. "He is coming back," the mason whispered. "He never left. The walls only wait for his voice." The boy said nothing more. That night, he dreamed of corridors that stretched forever, their ceilings dripping with water that whispered his name. When he awoke, his pillow was damp, though no water had fallen. Weeks passed, or months. Perhaps time twisted inside the palace like smoke trapped in glass. The new wing was nearly complete when the first accident occurred. A laborer fell from the scaffolding, but his body did not strike the ground. It vanished midair, dissolving into dust before the eyes of his companions. The others fled, crying that the stones had swallowed him. When the architects reported the event to the Senate, their voices shook. "The marble devours," they said. "It is hungry." The senators laughed nervously, but their laughter died quickly when the same thing happened again the next day. By then, even the bravest refused to continue building. But the walls did not stop growing. Every morning, new arches appeared where none had been before. The boy wandered through the half-finished corridors one evening, guided only by the faint blue light that seemed to pulse from the stones themselves. The air was cool and dry, yet he could hear faint murmurs coming from every surface. "We are the Empire," they whispered. "We are what he left behind." As he moved deeper into the labyrinth, the whispers changed, merging into something almost melodic, a rhythm of prayer and mourning. He found himself before a doorway he had never seen. It was carved with symbols that shimmered faintly, and beneath them, in delicate script, a name: Gaius, Caesar Augustus Germanicus. His blood ran cold. The door opened by itself. Inside was a chamber unlike any other. It was circular, the ceiling high, and painted with constellations that seemed to move as he entered. At the center stood a throne made entirely of mirrored glass, fractured into 1,000 reflections. Upon it lay the emperor's robe, folded neatly, and his laurel crown resting atop it. The air smelled of ash and rose oil. The boy stepped closer, drawn by something he could not resist. His reflection multiplied endlessly around him until he no longer knew which face was his own. Then he heard a faint sigh. Rising from beneath the throne, he dropped to his knees. Pressing his ear to the floor, the sigh became a whisper. Soft and unmistakable. "I am still here," it said. The boy jerked back, heart hammering. The mirrored walls shimmered, and for a moment he saw the Emperor's face reflected in them, pale, smiling. "Alive. You tended my silence well." The voice continued. "Now Rome shall dream. As I have dreamed." The mirrors darkened, and the light in the chamber dimmed to a faint red glow. The boy tried to flee, but the doorway was gone. The walls closed slowly around him, whispering words that felt like lullabies and curses intertwined. "Sleep. Little witness." They breathed. "Sleep. And remember." When he awoke, he was lying outside the chamber, his body covered in dust. The door had sealed itself. The architects who found him swore the room had never existed. They dragged him back into the daylight, where the senators demanded to know what he had seen. He tried to speak, but found that his voice trembled with something not entirely his own. "He dreams beneath us," he said. "And the Empire dreams with him?" They laughed at first. But that night, as they dined in their villas, each man heard faint tapping in his walls, slow, deliberate, rhythmic. Soon the whispers spread beyond the palace. Merchants heard them beneath their stalls. Fishermen claimed. The Tiber murmured in the Emperor's voice. Even the sky seemed to hold its breath, the stars dimming when his name was spoken. The Empire carried on outwardly the taxes collected. The legions marched, but the heart of Rome had grown strange, pulsing with the slow rhythm of a god who refused to die. The boy, no longer a boy, though he still moved like one haunted by childhood, became the keeper of silence, tending to torches that burned without smoke, listening each night to the walls recite fragments of the Emperor's dreams. He understood at last what Caligula had meant when he said he had conquered death. He had not defeated it. He had infected it, stretched it into eternity, woven it into stone and silence until Rome itself began to dream of its own end. And so the boy prayed, though no gods remained to hear him. "Let the dream break," he whispered. "Let the walls forget." But the marble only breathed softly in reply, its sighs slow and eternal. Somewhere deep within, beneath the layers of halls and mirrors and unmarked graves, a faint heartbeat continued, steady as law. And each night, when the moon rose over the Palatine, the city slept uneasily, murmuring in its sleep the name of the god who would not die. The palace had become a mausoleum of whispers. Even the torches burned differently now, their flames smaller, trembling, as though frightened by the weight of the air itself. Rome outside the hill went on pretending that its emperor had ascended to divine company. But those who lived within his marble labyrinth knew better. The Senate had ordered his name struck from certain tablets. The people muttered that a new ruler would bring peace. Yet every wall of the Palatine murmured still in his voice. Caligula might have been erased from scrolls, but not from stone. His dream lingered. His silence grew. And the boy, now the last of the servants who had seen him alive, carried the burden of that knowing like a brand beneath his skin. It began quietly, as all horrors do. One night, while tending the torches near the Hall of Mirrors, the boy heard something beneath the hum of the marble. It was not the murmuring that had haunted the palace since the emperor's disappearance. It was slower, deeper, and strangely alive, the rhythmic sound of air being drawn in and out, like a sleeper's breath. He knelt, pressing his ear to the cold floor, and the sound grew louder. Inhale, exhale. It came from below the earth, steady and patient, as if the palace itself were breathing. He whispered the emperor's name before he realized it, and the air trembled, the torches flickering as though startled. The sound stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it felt solid, pressing against his skull until his thoughts began to ache. The next morning, he went to the overseer of servants, an old woman who spoke little and believed less. When he told her what he had heard, she looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Others have heard it," she said. "Those who listened too closely never heard anything else again." She warned him not to return to the hall, but her voice broke at the edges, betraying the truth. She was afraid of what silence might say if left alone. That night, he returned anyway. The moon hung low over the palace like a blind eye, and the wind carried the scent of dust and roses, the emperor's favorite perfume. The boy crept down the corridor, past the veiled statues, until he reached the chamber's sealed door. He pressed his hand against it. The marble was warm. He waited. The air thickened. Then came the sound again, faint but unmistakable. Inhale, exhale. His pulse quickened. The warmth beneath his hand grew stronger, pulsing in time with the breath, until he could feel the rhythm traveling up his arm. Steady as a heartbeat. "Caesar," he whispered. The marble beneath his palm shuddered once. Like flesh waking from sleep, he stumbled back, gasping. The sound ceased again. For a long moment, he stood in the corridor, trembling between terror and awe. He knew then that whatever had been buried or had buried itself beneath the palace was not entirely gone. In the days that followed, the breathing spread. The guards near the baths complained that the floor throbbed underfoot. Musicians said their instruments hummed even when untouched. The marble fountains rippled without wind. A sculptor fled after claiming his unfinished statue had exhaled against his face. When the senators heard of these rumors, they sent priests to bless the palace. The holy men arrived in white robes and trembling hands, chanting prayers that sounded too fragile for such walls. They burned incense until the air grew thick, sprinkled salt upon the floor, and declared that no ghost could haunt a place so consecrated. Yet that very night, the palace sighed again, louder than before, and the priests were gone by morning. The boy began to dream of corridors filled with water. In his sleep, the marble floors gleamed like glass, and beneath them he could see shapes drifting slowly, a face here, a hand there, the shadows of those who had once served. In every dream, he walked toward a doorway lit by pale fire, and behind it, someone waited. He would wake with the taste of ash on his tongue and the echo of a voice whispering, "Breathe with me." He tried to ignore it, but each day the air grew thicker, heavier, until even the slaves began to cough, as though inhaling dust. The physicians called it sickness. The boy knew better. It was worship. The palace itself was exhaling its devotion, the way incense rises after prayer. At last, unable to bear the uncertainty, he went to the lowest level of the palace, the old catacombs that had existed long before Caligula's reign. Few dared to descend there. The air was stale, and the walls were carved with names, so ancient they no longer belonged to gods or men. He carried a single lamp and followed the faint sound of breathing deeper into the dark. The passages narrowed until he was forced to crawl. At the end of one tunnel, he found a small chamber hollowed out of the rock. There was no coffin, no statue, only a slab of marble in the center, polished, smooth, as if by hands that had never stopped touching it. The air here was warm, and each time he exhaled, the marble seemed to inhale. He placed the lamp beside it and leaned closer. "Are you there?" he whispered. The slab trembled, almost imperceptibly, and a faint voice answered not from the air, but from inside his own chest. "You kept my house." It said, "Now you shall keep my breath." The boy tried to run, but his legs refused to obey. The air thickened, pressing him downward until he knelt beside the marble. "Breathe," the voice commanded. He gasped, and the air rushed out of him like wind through a broken door. The lamp flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. "You see," the voice murmured, "death is loyal. It never leaves." When he woke, he was back in his chamber, his lungs aching as though filled with dust. The overseer found him at dawn, pale and silent. "Where have you been?" she demanded. He tried to answer, but his voice came out hollow, as if echoing from far away. "Below," he said. "He's beneath the stone." The woman crossed herself, whispering a prayer that belonged to no god Rome had ever named. That night, she fled the palace, leaving her torch still burning by his door. The boy remained. He felt the breathing now even in his sleep, a rhythm that matched his own. Sometimes, as he walked the corridors, torches would dim when he passed, and the marble would grow warm beneath his steps. The other servants began to avoid him. They said his eyes had changed, that his voice carried an echo. And in quiet moments, when he spoke aloud, the walls answered, not words, just breath, rising and falling, steady as the tide. He understood then what the emperor had become, not a man, not even a ghost, but the pulse of the empire itself. Caligula had made his tomb out of Rome, and every stone was a lung. One evening, the boy stood on the terrace, overlooking the city. The wind was still, the stars sharp and cold above the Tiber. He closed his eyes and listened. Far below, he could hear the faint hum of life markets, prayers, the clatter of chariots, but beneath it all, deeper than any human sound, came that same rhythm, the slow breath of something vast and dreaming. He placed a hand over his chest, and his heart matched it beat for beat. "You never left," he whispered. The air around him shivered, soft and approving. The torches bowed their flames toward him, and somewhere deep beneath the earth, the palace exhaled. The boy, no longer a boy, but a vessel, smiled faintly. "Then let us breathe together," he said, and in the distance, the whole hill seemed to sigh. The emperor's tomb had never needed a body, for his body was the stone itself, and the breath that haunted it was eternal. Rome would go on, but it would always breathe with him, slow and heavy, dreaming of the day when gods and men would trade places again. The years passed like ghosts drifting through corridors of stone. Empires rose and crumbled, but the palace endured, sealed and silent, its walls breathing faintly beneath the dust of centuries. The boy, who had long ceased to look like a boy, remained within, unchanged by time yet hollowed by it. His hair had grown silver, though his face barely aged, and his eyes reflected the marble's pale glow rather than the light of the sun. He no longer spoke to the servants. There were none left to hear him, and he no longer prayed to the gods. For the gods themselves had long been buried beneath the same silence that wrapped the palace like a shroud. He lived by torchlight and memory, and sometimes he could not tell which of the two was more fragile. Outside the walls, Rome changed hands and faces. New emperors rose, built monuments, waged wars, and died as if competing for a place in history's cruel laughter. Yet none dared to live upon the Palatine Hill. They said it was cursed. That strange sounds echoed there at night. That marble dust clung to the air like breath. Centuries turned the curse into legend, the legend into rumor, and rumor into myth. But beneath it all, the palace still pulsed, slow and patient, like a sleeping heart buried in stone. The boy alone remained to feel its rhythm. He kept no record of time. He measured the passing of years by the dimming of torches and the slow crumble of frescoes. Sometimes, when he wandered the upper halls, he found carvings left by intruders, soldiers, thieves, curious men who had broken into the ruins seeking treasure. None of them stayed long. Some vanished entirely, leaving only footprints that turned to ash. Others fled screaming that the walls had whispered their names. The boy never followed them. He had learned that fear belonged to those who still believed in escape. He had unlearned that long ago. One night, if night still meant anything, he heard footsteps echoing through the lower corridors. They were light, uncertain, and human. He followed them, his own feet soundless against the marble. At the foot of a staircase, he found a young woman standing with a lamp, her face pale in the flickering glow. She wore the robes of a pilgrim, torn and stained from travel. When she saw him, she gasped, nearly dropping the lamp. "Who are you?" she whispered. Her voice trembled like something fragile and living. The boy looked at her for a long moment before answering. "No one," he said. "I am the echo of a god." She stared, uncertain whether to laugh or pray. "They said this place was abandoned," she murmured. "They said no one lives here." The boy smiled faintly. "No one does." He turned, gesturing for her to follow, and she obeyed. Curiosity overcoming fear. He led her through the corridors, past the faded murals and the cracked mirrors that still caught glimmers of light. "What is this place?" she asked. "A tomb." He shook his head. "No, a breath that forgot to end." They came at last to the great hall, where the marble coffin once stood. Now it was only rubble, its fragments scattered across the floor like broken teeth. In the center lay the faint outline of a figure burned into the stone, Caligula's last shadow. The woman knelt beside it, touching the cold surface. "Is this where he died?" she asked softly. "He never died," the boy said. "He dissolved." The word hung in the air like incense. The woman shivered. "Then why do you stay here?" He looked at her, and his eyes reflected torchlight, the way deep water reflects stars. "Because he still breathes, and someone must listen." A faint tremor rippled through the floor, so subtle that she might have thought it her imagination, but the boy felt it clearly. The old rhythm, inhale, exhale. The walls quivered, dust falling from the ceiling like grey rain. The woman rose in alarm, clutching her lamp. "What was that?" she whispered. The boy closed his eyes. He remembers. The tremor deepened, growing louder, until the entire hall seemed to pulse. The air grew thick and warm, smelling of roses and ashes. "You must leave," he said, though his voice was barely audible over the growing hum. "This is not your world." But she did not run. "Who is breathing?" she demanded. "What is that sound?" The boy turned toward her, and for the first time in centuries, his voice broke. "Rome," he said. "All of it. Every stone, every shadow, every dream. It has been sleeping, and now it wakes." The lamp flickered violently. The marble beneath their feet began to glow faintly, as though fire burned deep inside it. The woman stepped back, terrified, but her gaze was fixed on the boy, who stood unmoving, his expression calm. "You can't stay here," she said. "You'll die?" He smiled. "I did." The light grew brighter, rising through the cracks in the floor. The entire palace seemed to exhale, a sound vast and mournful, like wind escaping a mountain. The woman covered her ears, But the boy raised his arms, as if greeting an old friend. From the ruins of the coffin came a faint shape, a ripple of light forming into a figure too bright to be seen clearly. It had no face, no voice, only presence. But the air bowed before it. The woman fell to her knees. "Is it him?" she whispered. The boy nodded slowly. "He never left," he said. "He was waiting for Rome to forget him." The figure drifted closer, and the light turned gold, then red, then soft as candle flame. The boy felt warmth spread through his chest, and the breath he had carried for so long finally matched the pulse before him. "I kept your silence," he said softly. "Now let me rest." The light trembled, as though considering, then it leaned toward him, folding the space between life and memory. The woman saw him smile, saw the glow wrap around him like smoke around incense. And then he was gone. The hall fell still. The light faded. The breathing stopped. For a long time, she knelt there, listening to the sudden quiet. It was not the silence of dread, but of completion, a stillness so profound it felt sacred. The torches steadied. The dust settled. The palace exhaled one final sigh, long and soft. And then it slept. The woman rose, her lamp trembling in her hands. The marble beneath her feet was cold again. The boy's footprints were already fading into dust. She left the palace before dawn, the first light of morning touching the broken arches. When she reached the hill's edge, she turned back once more. The great structure stood silent, half in shadow, half in sunlight, its columns gleaming faintly. For the first time in memory, there was no breath rising from it. No murmur, no whisper, only peace. She whispered a prayer, though she did not know to whom. Perhaps to the boy, perhaps to the God he had served. Then she descended toward the city, which was already waking to a new day, unaware that its oldest dream had finally ended. Centuries would pass again. The palace would crumble into ruin. The marble reused. The hill renamed. Travelers would wander through its remains, tracing their fingers across the stones and wondering why they felt warm to the touch. Scholars would argue whether Caligula had ever been buried there, or whether his madness had been myth. None of them would know the truth that a god had once learned to die, not in fire or blade, but in silence, and that one faithful heart had carried his breath until the empire itself exhaled its last. And sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind moved softly across the ruins, the people of Rome would claim to hear it, the faintest sigh rising from the stones, gentle and tired, like an old man finally at rest. They would say it was only the wind. But the moon, pale and patient above the city, would remember otherwise.